All right, here we are. I want to begin with thanks, deep appreciation to the ancestors of every community, in particular to the tribal land on which we stand, to our partners, our colleagues, our students, our alumni, our staff, and our planning committee. We've heard these names many times, but we really can't say it enough. Angela Riley, Mashana Goldman, Jessica Catalino, Pamela Grayman, and another important bridge builder and source of ongoing support, Carol Goldberg. I wanted to say how much I appreciate them being willing to step with us into a conversation with goodwill and the belief in the larger project, even as our differences in disciplines, vocabularies, expectations challenged us deeply to persevere, to believe that the larger project was necessary and important and demanded that we work through it all, that we sit with people that we do not normally sit with, that we talk with people we do not normally talk with, and in registers and in languages that are not always familiar. This is very hard, and it's appreciated that people came to it and have stuck with it. I want to also give thanks to my intellectual mentors, many of whom are here, both earlier. Gerald Torres may not remember, but I certainly remember when Whiteness as Property was a workshop paper, and I was trying to figure out what it was I was saying, and I said something about whiteness as property, and he said, hold on to it. Hold it. So thank you, Gerald. I want to also thank Neil Gatanda, who at a later stage in the paper came to my house, and those of you that know Neil knows that he thinks spatially. So we took the paper and literally had it up on the wall, a different kind of wallpaper. And to Kimberly, who I met actually after the paper was out, but whose work in race reform and retrenchment deeply inspired. And so I want to thank them as my mentors, and also to my later mentors, Laura Gomez, Devin Carbato, Jerry Kong, and Addie Rolnick, all of whom have taught me so much. So I want to carry on with Kim's food analogy that she began us with at the beginning, because it touches upon one of my favorite things, food. And I want to say that now it's time for dessert. So as much as one can love dessert, sometimes we crave something that has a bit of tartness. Things that are too sweet, they go down, they're cloying, they can be very hard to digest. So we want to bring a little bit of tart. We want to bring a little bit to that task and to reflect on the conversation that we're having. We have a group that is uniquely qualified to help us do so. So I'm going to introduce them by referring you to their bios, but also by foregrounding why we as the conference organizers thought it was important to call on them. Before I do so, though, I want to say something that I think is important to say, which is that we know that throughout this conversation there have been very hard questions posed, sometimes by the panelists to each other, sometimes from the floor, and not all of them have been answered. Some of them have hung there, right, in the silence, and we want to say that that's all right, because it isn't always possible in the moment, as much as we might think of ourselves as facile and quick, and we're not looking for the easy answers. If there were not questions that were left hanging there in that awkward pause, we would not have done our jobs. So I just want to thank everybody for posing them, for being willing to sit with the silence in them, and for being, to carry on further with the food analogy, to be willing to work to digest them. All right. The second thing is, I want to say this, and this is something Addie just promised, made me swear that I would say, or otherwise she's going to have to come up here with her sleeping baby and say it. And so I said I would do it. She very much appreciates all of the accolades for her intellectual contribution, but she wanted to acknowledge that this has very much been a collective project. And I think that we can both acknowledge her individual contribution and acknowledge that that's always true of any good idea. So with that. So to get to the dessert, we want to start with, I'll introduce them in the order that they're going to speak. We're going to start with Patrick Wolfe, and again I'll just refer you to the bios, in addition to which Patrick has lectured obviously and been visiting professor at a number of places around the globe, including Harvard and the Humanities Center at Stanford. He has many, many writings, including a forthcoming book on sovereignty, the frontiers of possibility, coming out with Hawaii next year. And I guess I would just describe that his work is a lodestar in sort of recentering colonialism and the particular forms that it has taken in settler societies, which I see have being central to unmasking the claims of liberal, democratic, racial innocence. I think that Patrick is really indefatigable. I think since the time that I have sent him an invitation, he may have sent me 4 drafts of 4 different pieces. And I'm saying to myself, I promise you, Patrick, I'm going to get back and tell you what I think, but then another one comes. So I want to say here publicly that I promise I will get back. But I think we may have finally done it in terms of forcing him at the limits of his energy. His voice is failing him now, but we're going to press him yet again to share with us this evening. Kehaulani Kauani is an anthropologist, author, and an important public intellectual. Her powerful book, Hawaiian Blood, is only one form of her intervention into issues of indigeneity and sovereignty, particularly as it relates to the Kanaka Maoli people. She is provocative and energetic and the host of an important radio program which I highly commend to you all, Indigenous Politics from Native New England and Beyond. It's just great stuff, particularly considering what's out here in the general media. Highly recommend it. Finally, but certainly not least, Antony Anghie, who I guess I would best describe, and I hope you take it in the terms that it's meant, as a legal polyglot. Meaning that he speaks many languages in law. He's trained in Australia and in the United States. He's on the faculty at Utah. He's visiting at Harvard now. But his work is really fascinating. It's at the intersection of legal history, colonization, and international law. And yesterday he gave a talk to the faculty. Yes, like right in the middle of all of this other talk, there's other talk, right? On one of the founding fathers of international law, and its relationship to imperialism and the rights of indigenous people. I think it takes up what Aileen so powerfully reminded us yesterday, the process of understanding the thing we are tracking, its logics, where it sleeps, and what it eats. It's a sort of looking at the history of international law and its embeddedness, how embedded in it is sort of logics of imperialism and colonialism. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the panel. As I said, they're going to speak in the order that they're seated. They're going to speak for about 15 minutes, and then we're going to ask them to engage each other, and then open up the floor if we have time and energy. Okay? Thank you.
I've got to keep the microphone really close. I'd like to start by paying my respects to the Tongva people whose continuing sovereignty and ownership of this land I wish to acknowledge. And then I would like to express, like everybody else, my deep thanks to Sal, to Cheryl, to Addie, to Rusty, to Angela, but also to people who can't hear me now because they're out there volunteering to keep the whole thing running. These wonderful students who've just done this fantastic job for us all. Perhaps somebody could pass on my gratitude to them. Sorry about this, and there's a cold. Sorry about this. It's a cold I picked up on the plane. My head's as bad as my voice. And I'm sorry also for coughing the whole way through the conference. But if you have to wrap up, you have to listen, so excuse all that. I want to start. I'm going to keep this simple and conceptual and try and sort of say some big things really basically, because I think that's an appropriate thing to do at the end, or take up some of the big points rather. I'm not sure I'll say them in a big way. And I'll start with, that shibboleth, race is a social construct, which is all too often taken as kind of a conclusion. There's a St. Teresa moment where you clutch your chest, roll your eyeballs up. Race is a social construct. Needless to say, it is, of course, a question, not a conclusion. When is it constructed? How is it constructed? To what ends is it constructed? What interest does that construction serve? And so on. So Sal told me he'd turn on the PowerPoint machine. So I'm going to start with that. As I'm talking about race and racism, I should say that I'm not going to engage in that white liberal finger dance that you can say any vile kind of racist or sexist or homophobic thing you like, as long as you're in this sort of cone of silence, this is magic trick. I'm not going to do that. Therefore, some of this stuff, seeing as I'm trying to nail racist discourse, is offensive. I would particularly, seeing as I'm discussing Australia, ask your indulgence, Aileen and Marcel, because there is, I have to deal with some of the viler of the concepts from the Australian racist lexicon. Okay.
If you pull it up to the left there, up there in the left corner, there you go. Oh, no, from the beginning.
From the beginning?
Yeah, there you go.
Some of you recognize this from the film. I've forgotten the name of the film. The Boundary Fence film. The Rabbit Proof Fence, exactly. Settler colonialism has not been well conceptualized in the academic literature. In particular, a lack of rigor has led to a confusion of vernacular and scholarly categories. So I want to start from this perspective, with the point of view, which is a kind of focus moment in Australian settler colonialism. This comes from a book published in 1947 by one A.O. Neville, who'd been senior Aboriginal administrator in the country. He was the protector, so-called protector of Aborigines for Western Australia. After 25 years, he retired and wrote his apologia, Australia's coloured minority, its place in our society, coloured in that vernacular, meaning people of mixed racial descent. On page 74 of this book, incidentally, was published in 1947, so at the height of the Nuremberg trials, when racial engineering didn't have a good name. This book's published. This photograph, which appears opposite page 74, is kind of PR for child abduction, for the theft of Aboriginal children. It's meant to reassure would-be adopting parents that they won't have atavistic throwbacks in subsequent generations. They won't suddenly have a black grandchild. This is based on a kind of bogus anthropology whereby Aboriginal people were held to be somehow relatives primevally of Caucasians and therefore kind of bred out easily. He actually went so far in the write-up that goes with this picture to say, you can see what's happening here. They just get whiter all the way down. He actually goes so far as to say, unless there's some Negro or Afghan in there, in which case all bets are off. They literally went there, okay? Now, the point that I want to make is about race, and coming back to blood quantum, and it's such an honour to be able to talk about blood quantum on a panel with Kehaulani. But that this notion that race is somehow a kind of static bodily entity, a proportion, is scotched by virtue of the fact that when you look at this picture, you see the full gamut of Australian racial arithmetic. It therefore contrasts with somewhere like Brazil or Louisiana or the Mexican caste system, which would go up to 64 or 128, whatever it was. Australia only went as far as 1/8. From then on, there's no 1/16th category, that's crucial. From 8th on, you have been bred white, okay, by fiat. In other words, this is not a static map of racial proportions, a kind of genetic balance. This is a 4-generational lap count to extinction. Okay, this is how it works. Right? So, in this sense, I'm asking us to look at the work of race, or how race works, what it achieves, as all that there is to be said about race, rather than anything ontological or in any detail. Okay? In which context? I'd like to suggest to you that there's a commonality between the photographs I just showed you from Mr. Neville's book and this handbook from the BIA Phoenix office, which was published as late as 1986. Just as the missing 1/16th category told you what was going on in the Australian picture, so I suggest to you the NI means non-Indian in the bottom left-hand part of this picture, whereby all the numerical categories that have got boundaries around them don't count as Indian, have the same effect as the lack of a 1/16th category in Australia. What they do is eliminate indigenous people from the statistical reckoning. Okay? So this looks very different. It's 40 years later, it's a different country, but they're both technologies of elimination of an indigenous group. Okay? So this is the basis upon which I want to start my discussion of what settler colonialism is, what it is, and how it is distinctive as a colonial relationship. Settler colonialism has been taken to exist wherever there have been colonial settlers, so that societies such as Rhodesia or French colonial Algeria, which depended for their existence on the exploitation of native labour, have been classified alongside societies such as North America or Australia, which did their best to avoid reliance on native labour. The resulting confusion has produced a plethora of subcategories, as scholars have struggled to fit an assortment of markedly different colonial societies into a single classificatory framework. Seeking a different approach, I speak of settler colonialism as I perceive it from an Australian perspective, a perspective born of a historical experience that differs significantly from those of white settler societies in southern Africa or Algeria, but which in certain important ways resembles the eliminatory forms of colonialism that have been visited on native societies as otherwise diverse as those of Palestine, Hawaii, Aotearoa, New Zealand, Tibet, West Papua, Chechnya, Kurdistan, and North America, to name but a few. In contrast to the kind of colonial formation that anti-colonial activists such as Cabral, Fanon, or Gandhi confronted, settler colonies were not primarily established to extract surplus value from mixing native labour with the land. Rather, they are premised on displacing natives from or replacing them on the land. Across the post-conquest generations, what settler colonialism, across the post-conquest generations, that's better, what settler colonialism reproduces is not human biopower, but human elimination. As Deborah Bird Rose has pointed out, to get in the way of settler colonialism, all the native has to do is stay at home. Settler colonialism, by my definition, means a logic of elimination, a project of replacement. It is primarily elimination rather than exploitation. This is not to say that natives who are left around won't be exploited. Of course they will, they come in handy. It is rather to say that the primary object of the settler project is not the exploitation of natives, but the removal of them from the land. Okay, so it's a question of priorities. Reliance on native labour also distinguishes Palestine from South Africa. And here I want to register a disagreement with the campaign to designate Israel as equivalent to apartheid. Apartheid is not simply a matter of spatial segregation as practiced in apartheid South Africa. It was a matter of exploitation. Bantustans were labour pools where a white minority manipulated that labour, moved it around to suit itself and so on, but haplessly depended upon it. In the case of the occupied Palestinian territories, Israel would love to be completely rid of that labour and not depend on it. It's an entirely different kind of relationship. It's not apartheid, it is settler colonialism. Okay? Hence it is not surprising that South African delegations found conditions for Palestinians in the occupied West Bank worse than they had experienced under apartheid. Apartheid had not sought to eliminate them. Howsoever rudely, it had depended upon their reproduction, and it produces an entirely different scenario. Thus, land rights are not apartheid, but the reverse. The mere fact of spatial segregation is not the issue. Okay? By the same token, Indian reservations are not comparable to Jim Crow segregation of black people. Indeed, the reverse is the case. For all their limitations, Indian reservations in North America and Aboriginal land rights in Australia are concessions achieved through anti-colonial resistance rather than colonially imposed systems of oppression. Correspondingly, Black America, and this is something which has come up repeatedly, I'm repeating it in the interest of having it opened up for discussion, so I'm putting it as simply as possible, okay. Correspondingly, Black American civil rights era campaign to be included on equal terms with white society promoted a goal, assimilation, that the native movement in the United States, as in Australia, was premised on rejecting. The historical differences run much deeper than the civil rights era. In North America, willingly or not, enslaved Africans participated in Indian dispossession. Correspondingly, there were Indians who not only owned but bought and sold black slaves. Indeed, Stand Watie, one of the leaders of the Cherokee Treaty faction at the time of the Trail of Tears, was a slaveholder who went on to become the last Confederate general to surrender in the Civil War. In a Manichaean moral universe, the empirical anomaly of good guys behaving like bad guys is hard to accommodate, confounding programmatic invocations of subaltern agency. For the liberal conscience, black invaders and Indian slave owners can represent altogether rather too much agency. The discomfort arises, of course, from the assumption that the enslaved and the banished, those whom James Madison distinguished as the black race within our bosom and the red on our borders, should naturally be companions in more than misfortune. The surprise occasioned by occurrences of tension between some black interest groups and Indian ones is an artifact, the surprise is an artifact of a liberal universalism that takes for granted a pastiche of difference, colours, races, minorities, ethnicities, on a multicultural canvas that levels the varied histories that produced these differences in the first place. Historically analysed, however, these apparent conflicts of sectional interest emerge as traces of the different but complementary roles into which the conquered populations concerned were co-opted by colonial settlers. In the cases of Indians and black people in the USA, contemporary differences testify to the distinct historical experiences of territorial expropriation and chattel slavery, of relationships based complementarily on land and labour respectively. These distinct modes of co-optation together subtended the overarching system of Euro-American settler colonialism, so solidarities should be framed at this more encompassing level. At this point, the extent to which I got anticipated by Robert Kelly gets totally overwhelming, so I shall leave my notes, and I will finish just on the kind of, ground zero of European property discourse, which is probably, Locke's two essays, in which private property is seen to accrue from the admixture of labour with land. If you apply your labour to soil to make it more efficient, which basically meant capable of sustaining a higher population than it could have done if left in its ostensibly natural state, then that is the basis on which you own that property. Now, in a settler colonial situation in this country, in British North America, subsequently the United States, that formula was colour-coded, right, with red people providing the land with which was mixed the labour of black people to produce white people's private property. Okay, so the point in terms of solidarities and resistance is that the whole social formation is made up, presupposes and relies on dispossession and labour exploitation in the context of the production of private property ownership. They are inseparable dimensions of precisely the same process, and that is a context in which they should be understood in relation to the building of solidarities. So I'll stop there.
Aloha kako, greetings everyone. It's really wonderful to be here. I just want to start by also acknowledging the tribal sovereignty of the Tongva Gabrielino people, as many others have, and to say I'm really thrilled to have been invited and to be participating in this gathering, and want to thank the conveners, the organizing committee, all the staff, administration, faculty and students that work together to make this happen. And also acknowledge all the wonderful food that's been served. It's not, so many conferences, it's sugar, sugar, sugar. And, for dessert, okay, but there's been good protein and greens, and it's really been kept things sustainable in terms of the energy level. So mahalo, thank you very much. I want to also just say the idea of the tickets of admission, I don't know who came up with that, but what a great idea. I read all of them and I enjoyed them and learned a lot from them, and I love the rationale in terms of providing a way for us to develop fluency for each other's work. I mean, I teach a lot of your work, so, but to actually get everybody to produce something that situates themselves in these fields and sort of this particular project was really wonderful. What I teach at Wesleyan University and how I'm located socially and politically in relation to my own familial and community commitments as well as my research interests, I think provide me with a perspective where I've been looking at these two different elements of the binary that people have been working to bring down. And that is, I mean, if I just named you my courses, you could probably see it immediately. I teach U.S. colonialism in the Pacific Islands, and I teach Native American sovereignty politics. And I teach methodologies in critical race studies and U.S. racial formations. And that, for me, is sort of the location in terms of where Hawaii is in many ways. And I do research on Hawaiian nationalism and Hawaiian land. And so much of that positioning, for me, speaks at the interstices and the overlaps in terms of where we are, the gaps as well as the interstices, I should say. And so it's been really interesting for me to sort of be in this context of being at the law school for the gathering and hear the sort of the way that the Hawaiian predicament has been framed as one of racial group or tribe, in quotes, right, federally recognized entity. Whereas in my own work, I've actually been theorizing the push for federal recognition, which is a federally driven proposal. It does not actually spring from the people themselves. Was proposed by the federal government, unlike how it's played out in many other places. I've actually been looking at the Hawaiian nation between kingdom and tribe. And kingdom not, where's Myvan? Aloha. Not because I'm wedded to a monarchy per se, but because it's a monarchical form of governance that was toppled, and so that's sort of our last legal genealogical governing entity. And so for me to see this kind of question of Hawaiians as a racial minority versus sort of an indigenous group is really different than the question that I've been trying to flesh out, which is the federal recognition proposal is a strategy of containing Hawaiian sovereignty versus Hawaiians having this pretty watertight legal genealogy to independent nationhood under international law. And I want to just give a little sketch of that, but then the rest of what I want to do is I prepared some notes this morning. I took 27 pages of single-spaced handwritten notes just from yesterday alone. And this morning I missed the concurrent session, and I'm really sorry I did, because I've been wanting to attend everything, but part of it is I just needed to sort of read through those and distill and prioritize, because I knew I was going to come here and write another 25 or 30 pages of notes, which I did. But I want to just present a bit of the Hawaiian case as sort of a window into some of these predicaments, and then the rest of what I want to do is really me riffing off some of the presentations that I heard, but also kind of pushing on some of the questions and raising some new questions, pushing on some of the questions that haven't yet been answered, but also the many that people brought to the table that I hope we can think about sort of what next, because I really hope that this project continues. This feels like one of those situations where part of it is developing that cross-fluency in these different camps, and in that sense it's the big tent event, and in many ways for me feels like a love fest, which in the best sense of it. But then, you know, sort of where do we go from here in terms of pursuing these different kinds of questions and projects and thinking about the intellectual and activist work to come, and the publication projects will be really interesting. But in terms of the Hawaiian case, just to sketch really briefly in terms of, for me, that distinction, and maybe what I can do is just put the third, not ditch the third prong of the race question for Native Hawaiians, because that's certainly part of the story, but that I would want to keep those three prongs then, the question of racial minority, the question of an indigenous governing entity, and then the question of an independent state. And what what we have, for those of you who may not know this particular history, is the Hawaiian Kingdom was established in 1810 by Kamehameha, who ended up being Kamehameha I. And by the mid-1840s, Kamehameha III was able to secure international recognition from the entire family of nations at the time. And the Hawaiian Kingdom held treaties with all European nations at the time, and then other nations in the Pacific and Asia. And none of those treaties were treaties of cession, and the United States also had 5 treaties with the kingdom, and none of them were treaties of cession. They were about recognizing each other's postal stamps and money orders. The closest one came to giving anything to the United States was letting the United States have use rights over Pearl Harbor, with the condition as favored nation status that if the U.S. sort of wrecked the port, they would be responsible financially for repairing the docks. And that's it. And so what you have at that time is the Hawaiian Kingdom really transforming from an indigenized institution and fortifying a defensive sovereignty, if you will, taking up a Western forum to defend against Russians, French, Spanish, Germans, the Brits, and the Americans coming through, and it really becoming a Western kingdom by the mid-19th century. And it wasn't until 1893 that you have 13 white men overthrowing Queen Kauani, the monarch, and they really thought that they were going to get the U.S. to annex Hawaii right away, and that was under the Harrison administration. But he was out, and Grover Cleveland comes in and sends Blount to actually investigate the overthrow, and Blount produces a 1,000-page report, and Grover Cleveland calls the overthrow an act of war and promises to reinstate the monarch, Queen Kauani, which he never does. It ends up being a political football in the Congress, and he's got his own battles with the Democratic Party. And when he called it an act of war, the 13 white men who had created a provisional government basically formed their own nation state called the Republic of Hawaii and told the U.S. to keep out as a foreign nation. And then it was the Republic of Hawaii, formed in 1894, that ceded our land to the United States federal government in 1898 under the McKinley administration. And this is really particular, and I have to acknowledge the work of Noe Silva and her remarkable path-breaking book and research, Aloha Betrayed, Native Hawaiian Resistance to U.S. Colonialism, because she unearthed a history of Native Hawaiian resistance that we really didn't know existed, and that is 2 massive Hawaiian nationalist groups at the turn of the century successfully mobilizing over 38,000 Kanaka Maoli. There were only roughly 40,000 living in the islands at the time. We'd had already many people migrating up to the Pacific Northwest and elsewhere, including Connecticut by 1809, where I'm living sort of in the colonial belly of the beast for Hawaiian history in New England. These 2 nationalist groups worked together to draw up what they called the Ku'e, or resistance petition to stop annexation, and successfully defeated the Treaty of Annexation before the U.S. Senate. That history was unknown until Noe Silva produced that work. And if you go to the statue of McKinley in Honolulu, under his arm it says Treaty of Annexation. The Hawaii was never annexed by treaty. So the lies of that colonial imperialist act are literally inscribed in the monuments. And what they did, because they couldn't round up the 2/3 majority vote in the Senate, was annex Hawaii by a congressional resolution in 1898, the Newlands Resolution. And that's in the context of the other island territories considered the insular territories. And that's part of what I teach in the U.S. and the Pacific course, and then Native America, and also how American Indian status is different than Alaskan Native status, and how Hawaii and the Hawaii question and Native Hawaiians as a people, Kanaka Maoli, are on these fringes in many different ways. Some positive ways and some negative in terms of how you think about enduring claims and what I call the outstanding claim to Hawaiian independence. And just as a side note, Stephen Kinzer's written a book called Overthrow that actually looks at Hawaii, the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom, as the paradigm for regime change imposed by the U.S. government. The subtitle is From Hawaii to Iraq, and he goes over these coups that are actually motivated by economic desire, where you have an internal person from the U.S. doing that. And so really looking at Hawaii as the paradigm for U.S. coups all over the world. And that he says that the Hawaii case sort of marks it as something different. after Rice v. Cayetano passed, Senator Daniel Akaka proposed federal recognition of a Native Hawaiian governing entity as the solution, as a protective measure, and indeed as a form of protective or defensive sovereignty for the Native Hawaiian people only, and that's important, and I'll say why in a moment, to actually create a federally recognized entity that he pitched as something that would be with parity with tribal nations in the lower 48 states. Well, actually, he didn't even get that specific. He said Hawaiians will have what Native Alaskans and American Indian tribes have. And I'm thinking, well, Alaskan Natives don't have what tribes in the lower 48 have, so already that was a big red flag. It was also a big red flag when both the Democratic and the subsequent Republican governors started stumping for this bill by lobbying for it in the Congress. And when a governor is pitching for a federally recognized indigenous entity, you know something's wrong, because no governor or state attorney general in their right mind wants another Native entity in their midst, precisely because of what Melinda was saying on the panel this morning. You know, it's the morning after, it's lawsuit land over all kinds of questions of jurisdiction, and it's moved into the federal model. But with the Akaka bill, named after Senator Akaka, which could be really called the Inouye bill, the state of Hawaii has always had a place at the table. And this has been one of the things that some of us have been saying, you know, sound the alarm bells for Indian country, because this really changes the model of federal recognition. And the bill has actually said, as I mentioned last night, that it's been through many drafts over a decade, but basically that any Native Hawaiian governing entity would be subject to both the criminal and civil jurisdiction of the state of Hawaii. And in more recent drafts actually saying the Native Hawaiian governing entity will never be allowed to take land into trust or have land held into trust. So no territory, no jurisdiction. And so it really is something different, and I really see it as something that takes away. The only thing that's actually saved us from that bill is neoconservative opposition that sees this as race-based government, matched with Hawaiian independence activists who have gotten into bed with the conservatives, who also see it as race-based government, and in their quest to try and move away from federal recognition have actually been really chauvinistically offensive around tribal sovereignty questions. And so saying, you know, we are better than a tribe, we had a kingdom, without actually talking about what that even means and what it looks like and looking at the historical trajectories. And they've actually been promoting the fact that the kingdom had citizenship afforded to people, citizenship, subjecthood, afforded to those who were beyond Kanaka Maoli because it was racially inclusive. But they've mangled that into this colorblind ideology and actually disavow indigeneity and even say Kanaka Maoli are not indigenous because they only see it as a category of subjugation. So it's been really complicated, and I'm critical of all of it, right? So, but yet, and it's not that I am wedded to a monarchy, but I also don't like the U.S. government trying to behead the kingdom. However, I am interested in dethroning the sovereign. I am interested in cutting off the head of the king, and yet I'm interested and committed to using the Hawaiian case as a way, as a legal tactic to actually call U.S. imperialism into question. So that's that kind of dance. In terms of the U.S. settler state, I really appreciate you fleshing out how you actually theorize settler colonialism in distinction to, say, Donald Denune's work, and talking about how Algeria and South Africa are different than, say, the four Anglophone settler colonial states. I think one of the things that, just transitioning into some of the notes that I prepared this morning, I think one of the things that where people get stuck, and I really appreciate what you said this morning. I'm sorry, I don't know your name by heart. The woman who spoke about reparations, Aju. Thank you, mahalo. Talking about really being after some of the same things but in different terms. And I think part of it has to do with the articulation and the disavowal of settler colonialism. And one of the things that came to mind was that when Obama was, right after he was elected, he talked about slavery as America's original sin. And everybody in Indian country was like, what? Right? And that kind of erasure that happens, right? And so part of it's what happened first instead of looking at these as interlocking systems. And I think that that's really what I think where we can get caught up, right? Instead of the red, white, and blue, it's the red, white, and black, right? In the color coding that you talked about. And, you know, when he campaigned, he went before the National Congress of American Indians on video. He didn't go in person. And he promised that if he was elected, he would honor all U.S. treaties with tribes. And so you've got this kind of doublespeak around I'll honor treaties, and yet you've got the American sin, the original sin of slavery. So, I mean, for me, I really want to go back to two questions that came onto the table the very first opening night, and that's Kendra Field's presentation examining Africans moving from freedom on Indian territory as settlers in relation to native slaveholding and native land dispossession, in light of also Stacey Leeds' critique of Cherokee Nation's assertion of sovereignty as wholesale application to do whatever they want, even if it's racially discriminatory in a repugnant way, and freedmen descendants going to the U.S. government, the feds, to actually ask them to impose and intervene by exercising plenary power. And I think that for me, those two questions together are sort of where we're still at in terms of how are we going to get through the structural kinds of relationships where these things are interlocking, and also keep our eye on the fact of not over-endowing different layers of agency, as Patrick's pointed out. In terms of the territorial conquest and marking colonialism, I mean, so many different terms have been put forward: settler empire, settler colonialism, but we're still sort of fighting, I think in many ways, the narrative or ideology of American exceptionalism and the myth of it being a nation of immigrants. And until we can get that, I think, on the table in the mainstream, I don't, that's a different kind of question than our work necessarily, but that is really one of the things that we just haven't, because that's also, you can have Obama talking about the original sin of slavery, but he still regularly says nation of immigrants. Why aren't we talking about U.S. as a settler colonial state and understanding, and Robin D.G. Kelly brought this out in your talk, colonialism, slavery is also a colonial form. And so we can talk about that. We can talk about different kinds of colonialisms and colonial relations with indigenous peoples as well as peoples of African descent. In terms of what are we talking about when we're talking about, stop, can I have some of the time that he didn't use? In terms of the question of what is sovereignty, what are we up against? And I think one of the things that I've noticed throughout the meeting is that assumption or slippage that every time someone says sovereignty, they're necessarily talking about state sovereignty. And I want to acknowledge, that we really need to think about some of the things that were offered yesterday. Maylee Blackwell talked about the ways that indigenous women in Mexico talk about autonomy and sovereignty in very expansive ways around their own, even corporeal sense. And also our keynote last night by Aileen Morton Robinson talking about white patriarchal sovereignty and how it's very different than quantum mocha sovereignty, and that in their substantial the relationships between spirit and country and all living beings. And I think that one of the things that's complicated when we're dealing with people working in U.S. federal policies, when people say indigenous sovereignty, they're more often not talking about actual indigenous sovereignty. They're talking about federally recognized tribal government sovereignty. And similarly, people have been talking about Indian law instead of federal law on tribal nations. So, I mean, I think we have to get that stuff clear. It's not just a matter of semantics. They're different epistemological frameworks, and they lead to very different kinds of results. And, Jessica Elgin in the concurrent session yesterday said that when she saw the conference, she said, I had to think, what is sovereignty and what does it mean to me? Which reminded me, Andy might appreciate this, that 1981 New Wave song, What is Sex and What Does It Mean to Society? But part of it is this question of what is sovereignty and what does it mean to me? Asking tribal sovereignty scholars whether we should dispense with the word sovereignty would be like asking critical race theorists to consider dispensing with the word race. And yet we know scholars in the late 1980s and 90s pushed for exactly that, even to the point where some scholars were actually using race in quotation marks with scare quotes. And so I think we really need to kind of flesh out those differences in terms of what we're talking about. And I also want to acknowledge Joanne Barker's essay, For Whom Sovereignty Matters, really talking about this debate, because in Native and broader indigenous, critical indigenous studies, the debates around sovereignty are really robust. But people are making the distinction between, as Audra Simpson brought out too, the sort of band council sovereignty and what's actually going on in the Longhouse, or what is the Ganawagi Code? What are the principles that people are standing by that are actually grounded in indigenous relationships that are way more expansive? And then the last thing that I'll just put on the table is this question of what's then the settler, if we're trying to think about what are we talking about when we're talking about indigenous sovereignty or indigenous peoples and indigeneity as a category. And Letty Volt, talked, and several panels of the panelists today on the second plenary talked about articulating immigration politics in relation to indigenous claims and looking at issues of complicity and exclusion. And Nandita Sharma raised yesterday from the floor the question of who counts as a settler colonist. But I also wanted to just flag that distinction. It's one thing to be a settler colonist and to be a settler, and I don't think that those actually need to be conflated. And also that there's the question of what is settler colonialism as a social formation and a process, right? Also with regard to the migrant may not stay. Migrants may not settle, but immigrants do. And I mean, that's, I think, where we have to actually get into that. And that's the nitty-gritty, hard conversations around complicity and really dealing with non-Indigenous people of color in relation to complicity with the U.S. settler state in oppressing Indigenous sovereignties and federally recognized governments, right? Two different kinds of tracks. And I think we really need to be able to have a really honest, maybe brutal conversation about what that looks like. But that can't actually happen until, as Melinda Lowry put on the table, until we call U.S. sovereignty into question and to really be willing to actually talk about its illegitimacy. And that's what I heard coming out in your presentation as well, Robin D.G. Kelly. So I've got other things to say that maybe I can work in during Q&A, but I really wanted to put that out on the table because that's when people are dealing with federal models and federal law, that isn't always on the table because of the sort of, the pragmatics of working within the U.S. legal system. But I think we have to have that on the table intellectually and politically to be able to forge the really difficult dialogues around where are people of color fitting in this and the question of settlerdom and settler colonialism as a social process. Thank you.
Well, let me begin by like everybody else, thanking the organizers for this wonderful conference, particularly thanking Cheryl and Azla Bali, who were instrumental in getting me here. I'm very honored to be here, and as was mentioned, I am principally a student of international law, and I'm interested in the history of international law. And so what I have been doing over the last many years, is to try and examine the relationship between imperialism and international law and try to think of different ways of writing the history of the relationship between imperialism and sovereignty and international law. In this regard, a lot of my work has been inspired by what has been done by critical race theory scholars like Kim Crenshaw and Cheryl, because so many of the questions are questions that we have in common. So, for example, the whole idea that race has disappeared, which is a commonplace idea in many circles, is very comparable to the idea that colonialism ended with decolonization. And I'm glad to say that we have had some conferences where critical race theory scholars have met with a group of scholars to which I belong called TWAIL, Third World Approaches to International Law. And for example, Ruth Gordon organized a wonderful conference at Villanova, and a volume emerged from that, which is a sort of collaboration between TWAIL scholars and critical race theory scholars. I must say, I thought I knew something about colonialism and sovereignty and international law until I came here, because I felt I understood the trusteeship system. I spent so much time studying the trusteeship system, and then we have these wonderful presentations about the Mariana Islands and about Guam and about Hawaii, which present to me a dazzling and somewhat discouraging picture of all the different varieties of colonialism that occurred under the umbrella of the United States. So I really feel very indebted to the wonderful presentations that we have had, and I'm also indebted to these tickets, because I have to confess that by the time, I think by mid-morning today, I was feeling a little dazed, and I was very glad that people like Neil Gotanda were presenting sort of flow diagrams that would enable us to understand all the complexities that were going on. Let me just take up some of the themes. Well, I should say that I've been obsessed by the whole issue of sovereignty and race and imperialism, not only over the last few days, not only because of this conference, but also because of another major event that has been taking place many thousands of miles away, and that is the World Cricket Cup final. Some people have discussed the whole issue of imperialism through the lens of, particular tribal experiences of Guam. I hope eventually to discuss the whole issue of race and sovereignty and civilization through the lens of cricket. But let me come to that later. The first thing I would like to do is to talk a little bit about a theme that was mentioned very much by Aziz Rana, interestingly enough, in the opening plenary, and then taken up wonderfully in the last plenary, and that is the whole question of the relationship between what we might call internal and external sovereignty. So what I would like to talk about a little bit is to flesh out some aspects of external U.S. sovereignty. And here, what I am interested in is the whole question of, well, how is the United States perceived in the rest of the world in terms of the U.S. policies in relation to the rest of the world. And here we have to ask some fairly complicated questions, and I'm glad that Cheryl has legitimized the asking of questions to which there are no easy answers, because what I'm going to do is to simply present another set of questions that has been puzzling me, and I'd like to get this off my chest. So in that regard, what we have is a situation of, on one hand, a powerful idea that the West has lost its legitimacy. And here we can talk about international law as being a lens to which to approach this question. Let us take, for example, the issue of human rights. So in the 1990s, there was a very powerful idea that the West is the repository of human rights and the rest of the world is uncivilized, and the whole task is to transform or translate human rights from the West to the non-Western world. All that changed after 9/11. In fact, it changed pretty much almost immediately after 9/11, because one of the startling things to those of us who are interested in international law is the extent to which the whole idea of human rights was so powerfully undermined as soon as this tragedy occurred. So all these rights which were regarded as fundamental, essential, incontrovertible, suddenly seemed to exist on very fragile ground. And what seemed to happen, indeed, was a mechanism by which the whole idea of security took over. That's another term we might think about in terms of sovereignty, because in terms of external relations, the whole idea of U.S. sovereignty is being extended through the idea of security, and it is overwhelming everything else, pretty much, in the world of international law. So this was startling. And when we look at things like the torture memos, what I find really interesting and a little disturbing is the extent to which it is law itself that is used as a mechanism to undermine the law. It's a new type of legitimation and violence, as opposed to the good old-fashioned Oriental despot type of violence where all these terrible things are being done, but they're never justified in that intricate language of law. There's a clear understanding of what is happening, as opposed to an attempt to disguise this as being, well, this is permitted by the law itself. So Asian countries, other countries are not entirely foolish. They understand what is happening. And the interesting thing is that what is happening is that the West, or I should say particularly America, is shifting more towards the types of arguments that were traditionally made by Asian countries. Asian countries who are characterized as saying, our development, our stability is more important than human rights. And they were continuously criticized for making this argument, and now we find it is the United States that is making this argument. And not only making the argument, but developing it in really, I would say, intricate and insidious ways. Let us then take the other great, you could say, prong of Francis Fukuyama's argument of the end of history. The other great prong is to say what we have arrived at is liberal democracy and free market capitalism. So let us look at the whole issue of the global economy. If we look at what happened in 1997, there was a global economic crisis which emerged from Asia. And so this is the familiar idea, Asian contagion, threatening the rest of the world. And then who were the heroes who stepped up to deal with this? Larry Summers and Tim Geithner. Well, fast forward, 2008, where does the crisis come from? It comes from here. And it is a crisis which overwhelms the world, and then on closer scrutiny, it turns out that it is the US which is following practices which are being advocated for all the other countries and which are not being adhered to here. Because here it is seen that we're exceptional, these instruments will work, and we have all the best minds working on these issues. That's the other leg of legitimacy which is really being powerfully undermined, and which I think we need to really pursue, this whole idea of expertise, the idea that the best minds, the best and the brightest, once again, have got us into this fix. And so we have all those things taking place, and Iraq is regarded as a huge disaster by many of the Asian scholars and many of the Asian commentators in terms of what has happened. I don't think they would have minded if Iraq had been a success. The fact that it was illegal wouldn't have mattered if it had worked. But to have engaged in an activity which was not only illegal but incompetent is seen, I'm sorry, by Asian eyes as being especially reprehensible. So, in all these different ways, and I'm being, I'm being a stereotypical Asian, so I'm sorry, but there we go, efficiency in that Asian mode. So in all these different ways, there is a change taking place globally. And I would suggest to you that I don't want to buy into this empire in decline approach, which is being foisted by, of all people, Neil Ferguson, for example. But there is a change. I think globally there is something going on, and many of the Western countries are caught up in this. So the question then is, what does this mean to external US sovereignty? And how does this play into what is happening here within the United States? All sorts of interesting connections can be made, but I'll just lay it out there. The other question I'd like to ask is the whole question of race and sovereignty in the context of a figure who presents himself as being the inheritor of the great tradition of Martin Luther King, now being the embodiment of US sovereignty. And that is, of course, President Barack Obama. So what I'm interested in is this curious configuration that has occurred. Race and sovereignty. And of course, I don't have time to analyze all this, but we have different visions of sovereignty presented, for example, in, I would say, 3 speeches. Goodness, I won't be able to get to the cricket. I'm sorry about that. 3 speeches. Obama's Nobel Peace Prize speech, Obama's speech in Cairo, and Obama's speech recently about Libya. And what I find really interesting about some of those speeches is the way in which he embraces Martin Luther King, and then at the same time, in his Nobel Peace Prize speech, he says, I am an inheritor of this great legacy, but what Martin Luther King said cannot take us as far, it does not help us to deal with situations where there is real evil in the world. As though Martin Luther King did not understand this. So on one hand, arguing and in his capacity as commander-in-chief saying there is evil in the world, as a sovereign, as the mega-sovereign, and then arguing, I have to address this. On the other hand, in his Cairo speech saying, non-violence does not achieve anything, to a different audience, and I wonder what the source of that difference happens to be. So again, we have a difference in the sense of saying, as sovereign, I can engage in war. And this goes back to what Aziz Rana said about the sovereign in his external behavior focusing on discretion. It's not law, it is discretion. And how is that discretion going to be exercised? On the other hand, non-violence is speech to entities which are pretty much non-sovereign. So I'm interested in the question of the relationship between sovereignty and war. Who gets the right to make war? Because if you're not sovereign, you don't have the right to go to war. So, what does all this mean in terms of the current configuration? Here we are in Libya. Here the United Kingdom is spending $5 million pounds a day at a time when people are rioting in London because they don't have the funds for education. What does all this mean? I would want to switch to the other side and talk a little about what's happening in the third world. Because there's a great project, which is the project that has inspired the 12 group, and that was the project of the third world in the 1960s and the 1970s. That was the project of creating a new international law. And we have a number of important declarations and resolutions trying to achieve that. None of that worked because of the limitations of sovereignty, which many of you have mentioned. However, we now have an interesting situation where the third world has, or at least some members of the third world, have not only rhetoric but power. And we can talk about Brazil, Russia, India, and China. The interesting question to me is, are they going to now change the system, or what will that change be? Or will they rather simply say, international law is an expression of power. It works for those who have power. And now that we have power, we are going to work this system to our advantage. And so we can see this in a number of interesting ways. And so the whole idea of the third world itself is becoming very problematic. And then we have to look at the whole question of what we might call internal colonialism. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about the Indigenous Peoples Declaration in the context of Kansas, which I think is an important discussion. I'm also interested in the whole question of the status of indigenous peoples within the third world itself. The indigenous peoples, the tribal peoples in India, or the tribal peoples in Central America, and so forth. So there are all these complicated reconfigurations taking place externally in terms of the whole issue of sovereignty. Let me finally I just have to say a few things about cricket. I can't leave it alone. Cricket as sovereignty. And cricket is the ultimate colonial game. When I was growing up in Sri Lanka, the pavilion had a message presented to it in large letters saying something like, it counts not that you won or lost, but how you played the game. In other words, winning and losing doesn't matter. It's a question of being civilized by losing gracefully. And this for a long time is what the Sri Lankan cricket team felt they should do. And at the same time, there was another principle which said something like, umpire's word is law. In other words, no matter how unjust the umpire's verdict, no matter how clearly wrong it was, one had to be civilized about it, and one did this by accepting the verdict and then walking off the field. Again, it's a very convenient type of principle to present to the colonized people. So, cricket is very much a case of the civilizing mission. It was through the process of cricket that civilization was brought to the colonies in various ways, and I won't go into all the details. But for example, let's take the case that cricket is played in its best form over 5 days. So civilization implies time and leisure. Not only that, cricket stops for tea. So we stop for tea and have cucumber sandwiches and tea going back to the pavilion. And the whole idea of cricket is so powerful as a civilizing influence that it has now spread to various other parts of the world. I will just read the headline from this BBC story, Los Angeles cricket. Club helps tame Compton's mean streets. And so there is a Compton Cricket Club which has now been established, and one of the things that the police have said about this is something like, we were so successful at teaching homeless guys civility through the game that we lost a lot of players, meaning they left the homeless shelter. And the other argument is something like, basically saying something like American games just don't work. I don't have the quotation, but I'll provide that to you. So cricket is a colonial game. On the other hand, it is precisely through cricket, C.L.R. James has written a great book about this called Beyond the Boundary. Cricket is a mechanism by which many countries have found self-expression. And it was when the West Indies beat England that they felt a sense of self-worth and self-respect, a sense of nationhood. And so this is the great thing about sovereignty. In other words, the whole reason, or one of the principal reasons why sovereignty is so powerful is the idea that once you get it, you can truly be yourself. In other words, you can protect your own culture through the whole edifice of sovereignty. So cricket is very much like this. So each country plays cricket in its own way. So the Pakistanis, chaotic, disorganized, continuously bickering among themselves, but brilliant on their own day. The West Indies, they party all night and still beat everybody else on the next day. So the story would go. The British, well, not particularly talented, but they are very well organized, and they have the good sense to get players from the colonies to play for them. The best British players turn out to be South African. The Australians, the most successful team in the last 25 years, an amazing team. I didn't know what to describe the Australian team as being until recently. I just thought, on the basis of Patrick's presentation and so many comments in this forum, I would call it settler cricket. Settler cricket because it is absolutely ruthless. It is absolutely single-minded, and its purpose really is extermination. So, in other words, when other teams play cricket, the basic idea is, look, as long as we win, it's okay. In the case of Australia, it is we're going to win by the greatest margin, and we're going to humiliate them. So it's something like the model of British India in 1857, something like that. To complete my story, you may not notice this, but I am in mourning. I am in mourning because India beat Sri Lanka. So this is all a form of therapy. It has nothing to do with the conference, but I just wanted to let this out. But the great thing now is that at least Sri Lanka beat England. And so what I simply want to say is it is possible that this colonial artifact can be used by different countries in their own way to express themselves and achieve something through that process. Thank you.
Tony, I want to thank you because I was wondering if we would finish in time for me to see any of the NCAA. Any of the NCAA playoffs. I don't know. My team that I'm rooting for is Virginia Commonwealth, and and the coach's name is Shaka Smart. What can you say, right? Okay. And we're not going to finish in time to see the game, but that's all right. As Kim reminded me, we're doing the Lord's work. So I wanted to just starting actually with you all to visit a couple of points of challenges, and I do want to leave some time for questions, but I did want to return to a couple of themes that I think run through some of the questions and run through some of the things that that you have spoken about. And I want to start with Patrick. And I actually want to return to the distinctions that I think you were trying to draw regarding your understanding and use of the term settler colonialism. And the reason I want to return to it is for two reasons. Because I was struck by, I think in some of our earlier conversations, the ways in which the invocation of that term both seem to generate a certain kind of recognition as well as a certain kind of concern or worry or set of questions regarding, one, its distinctions from imperialism, two, the way in which it may, and I'm borrowing from Jessica now, sort of illuminate and obscure. And I think in the best sense of what we understand to be sort of dialectics, I mean, I think that within the seed of everything is its opposite, right? The question then is what is it that it's helping us to see? What is it that it helps us not to see? Or I should say obstructs us from seeing? And how do you see it as being distinctive from or related to questions of imperialism?
Yep. Oh, sorry, you want me to...
I can pose each of the questions to the three of you, or...
no, it's okay, I just thought I'd get time to think up an answer.
You can. I have a question for Kehaulani, and then we can proceed on.
I could answer.
So, Kehaulani, you have, I think importantly, called our attention to the particulars and the importance of understanding Native Hawaiian history and how that history is distorted in a particular account of Rice v. Cayetano, right? That is to say that I think you have suggested that, or not just suggested, but specifically said that the notion of framing Rice v. Cayetano as simply a question of is this a political group or is this a racial group, it confounds rather than sort of helps us really understand what's at stake. And you've specifically, I think, referenced to the fact that it was not a case technically under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, but rather under the 15th Amendment provisions with regard to voting. But I want to understand what you mean when you say, I certainly get, I think, the idea that framing Rice as a loss, as a loss in a legal context, has facilitated a particular kind of political intervention that is deeply problematic. That is, the Akaka bill has used the fact of Rice to achieve a particular political aim. But standing outside of the moment for the question of sort of how it's been deployed, I want to understand what you mean or how we should better understand it and what is at stake in terms of understanding it as something other than a loss. Because if it is dangerous to characterize it as a loss, how should we understand it? What is the language that we should use in terms of that case? And what I want to say specifically is this, and it may be a mistake on my part, but what I saw as being particularly problematic about Rice v. Cayetano, in addition to the obscuring that sort of followed in its wake, is that it imported actually a particular flattened kind of equal protection analysis into the 15th Amendment. That is to say that one of the problems of the case, to put it more specifically, is the 15th Amendment was about providing the right to vote and saying that Congress could pass laws under it to prevent discrimination in voting. So in a way, it was a location where color blindness had not fully migrated. That is to say, the Voting Rights Act was one of the few provisions where you could still take account of race because it was seen as being appropriate for remedial intervention. So one of the great dangers of Rice then is you have the kind of colorblind jurisprudence of the 14th Amendment being wholesale imported into the 15th Amendment analysis on the backs of Native Hawaiian sort of claims and interests. So I want to understand better how to tell that story or how to relate that account in terms that don't do damage, further damage. Because one of the things that I'm particularly struck by with respect to Rice, as you describe it, is that sort of Native Hawaiian sovereignty interests are nowhere in the case. That is, they're not fully represented in the case. You have sort of the state against the state fighting over this question, which to large measure actually mirrors the framework of most affirmative action cases. That is to say, it's the state, it's Grutter versus Bollinger, it's Bakke versus the University of California, and the parties and interests, that is to say, the bodies of the students and their families who are fighting to get in are nowhere in the case, right? The best you can do is sort of wave on the sideline and say, can I be an amici? So I wanted to pose that question to you. And Tony, I don't know what to ask you other than to say.
That's fine. That's fine.
I wanted to think about. I wanted to think about the question of how this erasure of colonialism occurs through international law. I mean, I think you've spent a lot of time talking about it, but I want to actually understand that process better. And if you could map out for us how how this process sort of is achieved so efficiently, such that we can talk about in certain contexts, I shouldn't say we, but I'm saying that it is considered legitimate to talk about international law absent any discussion of colonialism, right? I mean, so that's for the three of you.
Okay, here we go on. Settler colonialism and imperialism. Firstly, there isn't a competition. The imperialism is an indispensable category. The issue is whether or not settler colonialism earns its place as an additional category, in which I think the simplest way I could answer it, that is, I'm going to be less simple, but is to say that one wouldn't want to ask, what's the value of a concept like slavery and how does it relate to imperialism? The answer is it's a central component of imperialism, but it's a relationship whose specificity you don't want to lose. Now, settler colonialism I see in exactly the same light, except I think that specificity has been overlooked and therefore needs emphasizing within the overarching context of the imperial project as a whole. So I want to say three things about imperialism and how it relates to settler colonialism. The first is to seize upon Robin Kelly's license for being an unreconstructed Marxist in borrowed plumage, which, yes, I kind of fess up to. And that's to go back to the Brenner debate and the Hobsbawm debate in British Marxism, which pointed out that when Robin, thank you for mentioning primitive accumulation. That's exactly what it's all about, right? And could there be a more primitive accumulation than the application of enslaved labour to stolen land? No. But what was overlooked, I think, in British debates in the, I'm not sure when, 60s or so, before even my time, was the question of consumption. There's this whole narrative about, you create a proletariat in factories and they leave their estates in the countryside and they go and form a city, and that's it. It's all about production. When you're a proletariat living in the city, you haven't got a cow in the backyard, okay? You can't eat cash. You have to use the cash which you get in exchange for your alienated labour to buy the products of that labour. In other words, consumption is as central to the development of capitalism as production. How do you expand markets? You expand them overseas. And who are the consumers in the overseas markets? They are the settlers. And the settlers work on the plantations and in the mines and all the rest of it that produce the raw materials for the Industrial Revolution. It's an inseparable global phenomenon. To which settlers are indispensable for its expansion. So firstly, with regard to consumption, the role of the settler within imperialism needs to be. The second advantage, I think, of settler colonialism as a paradigm is that it evades the rather formalistic, the rather legalistic language in which theories of imperialism operate. Settlers are more often than not a frontier rabble who the metropolitan state disavows. I mean, the classic example is the settler movement in the occupied West Bank, right? But it's the mavericks on the frontier. It's the kind of genocidal hordes that raced across the Australian outback. The colonial government typically throws up its hands in horror and says, wasn't that an awful thing to happen? And then they take the land that these people stole anyway. They're an inseparable component. So we shouldn't be making these distinctions between formal power and informal, and using a concept like settler colonialism, which is not tied to metropolises, to governments, to officialdom and all that, enables us to do that. It also cuts beneath the level kind of election results and national independence, even all of that. Come national independence in a different kind of colony, say franchise colony like India, 1947, most of the whites go home. The colour of the faces on the legislative benches change. In Australia, in North America, that doesn't happen. The white guys don't go home. In fact, if anything, national independence deepens the stranglehold of the settlers on the indigenous people. So view that in terms of settler colonialism rather than the kind of paradigm which follows these formal developments like national independence enables us to see why post-colonialism generally has a bad name amongst indigenous scholars. It's the post part that's the problem, okay? And lastly, settler colonialism viewed as a global structure enables us to get away, and this is with respect to you, Nandita Sharma, our disagreements, we've learned to live with it, I think. Settler colonialism is a structure, okay? It is a global relationship. The fact that I'm a reluctant settler in Australia, I wish I wasn't a settler, doesn't distinguish me so far as being part of the settler colonial project is concerned from the worst of Australian racists. The issue is not anything to do with voluntarism, it's not to do with intentionality, it's to do with a structural relationship with indigenous people. I am part of the settler colonial project. There's nothing individual about it. Okay, so my consciousness is neither here nor there in all of this. And that's another reason why the paradigm itself, I believe, has advantages.
Thank you. Kehaulani.
Okay. Thank you for the question, because it gives me an opportunity to say more, because I don't want people to think that I don't have a critique of how this introduced colorblind jurisprudence in the case. Before I give my full-blown answer, I want to acknowledge Ashwini Mate, who's sitting in the audience, who's a UCLA law school alum, who was actually in her first year at Wesleyan University as an undergrad, the same year that I was a first-year assistant professor in 2000, which was also the year that the ruling in the Rice case came out. And Ashu served as my research assistant for a year and helped me dig out anything and everything on not just Rice v. Cayetano, which I had heard argued before the court in October of '99, but also every law review article on the planet that deals even remotely with Hawaiians or Hawaii, as well as insular case law dealing with Hawaii. So mahalo, it's really great to see you. And we've been in touch this whole time, and she's an attorney in her own right. It's just really great to see you in here. This goes back to Rose mentioned Chris Ijima's article on the Rice case, and he, I believe, is the first one that pointed out that Rice was the first instance in which the 15th Amendment had been used by the courts to protect the rights of a white man. Mm-hmm. And that's the twisted, the twisted perversity of the ruling, and I don't want that to go unremarked or I want to talk about that too. I think for me, it's not that I see it as a loss in the same way. Your question was, can we understand it as anything other than a loss? Well, it was one of your questions. But also, when you said that colorblind jurisprudence was being used in the case, you said, put out on the backs of Native Hawaiian claims and interests. And that's where I disagree. And that's what I was trying to get at last night in talking about the Office of Hawaiian Affairs as a state agency, because I don't actually think the law, I don't think it's right that the colorblind jurisprudence was used in that way. And also for background, some of you may be aware of this, like the affirmative action cases, these cases are cherry-picked. The attorney at the lower court level for Rice went through 23 different test cases before he could get this one to stick. And it wasn't even that he actually was going after the Office of Hawaiian Affairs per se. What had happened was in 1996, the governor of Hawaii had actually formed a sovereignty elections council where he picked, at the time, 19 different people to sit on a governor's board, and they were really trying to actually co-opt the sovereignty movement and keep it contained within the state system. And there was going to be an elections council vote, and he actually was trying to go after that piece, and it didn't stick. And after over 20 cases, the Rice case stuck. Rice is fourth generation in Hawaii who owns half of Maui. His forebears were traders to the kingdom. He has a really long enduring legacy, so he's a very particular kind of person because he's the ultimate settler colonist. He's the ultimate. In fact, one of my forebears was one of his forebears' wet nurse in the Opunui line. So I mean, this is like he's a full-on colonial kid in Hawaii. That's Opunui. I just want to acknowledge that Tutu's lineage. But the case had so much more in it, and part of that, which you alluded to, was this question of whether or not Congress had the right. Was there an interest in the state, a rational interest, because the state was trying to uphold, or the Office of Hawaiian Affairs attorney for the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, John Roberts, said that the state of Hawaii, in conducting racially exclusive elections, was trying to uphold a provision in the State Admissions Act that said that the so-called public lands of Hawaii, one out of 5 reasons, uses of those lands have to go towards Native Hawaiians, defined by the 50% blood quantum rule. And those are the 1.8 million acres of Kingdom Crown and government land that were ceded by the Republic of Hawaii, and the U.S. claimed them and then gave them back to the state at the time of the State Admissions Act in 1959, which gets back to OHA. So there's an important piece about that I want to come back around to. But part of it is the Office of Hawaiian Affairs was charged with seeing the trust of the revenues from 1/5 of those so-called public lands that were the former Kingdom Crown and government lands. those revenues never went to the Office of Hawaiian Affairs anyway, and the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, they really have been chomping at the bit to sell those lands. So, I mean, I can't say enough times that OHA is a state agency that has been in the business of actually oppressing Hawaiians. And so the only thing for me around the Rice case that was sort of a relief was that they didn't actually go into the 14th Amendment at all, and that it was a very narrow ruling. But what they've ended up doing shows where their interests really lie, because they actually basically just partnered with the executive branch of the state to broker a deal that actually evacuated the contents of a massive land case before the U.S. Supreme Court that was ruled on in 2009, where John Osorio, a Native Hawaiian professor, Jonathan Kanmakaviva Ole Osorio, took the state of Hawaii to court in 1994, and OHA was a defendant, was going to be a defendant originally because they wanted to sell the lands, the state wanted to sell the lands, and it was basically a competition of who could sell these in the case it was 1.2 million acres because of some different other legal trust issues. And they wanted to sell them the same way the executive branch of the state did. It's just that they wanted that money to go into their coffers. And the attorney for Osorio said, you better get on the plaintiff's side, because in the motion of discovery, all the corruption of the Office of Hawaiian Affairs is going to come out. And so they were in the case with John Osorio and 3 other individual Kanaka men. And when the U.S. Supreme Court said that the U.S. apology to the Hawaiian people over the overthrow couldn't be used to prevent the state from selling these lands before they could actually be adjudicated in an outstanding land claims, the Office of Hawaiian Affairs just got right in bed with the state and the other 3 Kanaka and basically challenged John Osorio's standing by saying he didn't meet the 50% blood quantum rule and that the case was no longer ripe for adjudication. So for me, looking at the Rice ruling in the context of what the Office of Hawaiian Affairs has done to really compromise those claims, as well as the bankrolling of the campaign in support of the Akaka bill, I don't see it as being on the backs of Native Hawaiian claims. It's just another branch of the state. I mean, not a branch in terms of a branch of government, but it really is a way of, I think, just recirculating the funding and still selling off the lands that have never been privatized to this day. I mean, we're talking about 1/3 of Hawaii. That's the centerpiece of the Hawaiian nationalist struggle. That's why people want to reclaim those lands.
Thank you.
Thanks, Cheryl. Just a brief response. One of the real complications, or one of the real important reasons, I think, why imperialism does not feature very much in an understanding of international law is because the classic problem that international lawyers have attempted to address is the problem of how is order created among equal and sovereign states. So this is why it is argued that international law is not properly law. It is not properly law because for law to properly exist, there has to be a vertical system of authority whereby the sovereign actually makes the law and enforces the law vertically. In the case of the international system, we only have equal and sovereign states. There is no overarching sovereign. That is the problem that has preoccupied all the great minds of international law for the last 200 years. There's a small problem with this concept. The problem is that it cannot tell us anything about the non-European world, because the non-European world was not sovereign. So to understand the situation of the non-European world, we have to ask a prior question, which is, how was it decided that the non-European world lacked sovereignty? So that's the question I wanted to ask. So rather than the traditional approach, which sees international law as creating sovereignty in the West and then transferring it to the poor, deficient, non-sovereign, non-Western world, the argument I have is sovereignty doctrine has within it mechanisms of exclusion. It's a double movement whereby the non-European world is excluded from the realm of sovereignty, and that exclusion immediately demands its incorporation. If international law is going to be universal, that's another principal aspect of international law. It's not in international law unless it is universal. But to create this one uniform system of sovereignty, of Westphalian sovereignty, there has to be this process of exclusion and then inclusion and incorporation. So that is, so in other words, the fundamental theoretical framework that has governed inquiry about international law for the last 2 centuries is a framework that has been based on European experience and which has then been transformed into this abstract universal theoretical question. So that's what I want to challenge. The other reason why, more prosaically, why imperialism is thought to be over is because there is something like a conscience in international law, because it's hard to deny that international law was completely complicit with imperialism in the 19th century. But then we have the League of Nations and the trusteeship system and the mandate system and Woodrow Wilson and self-determination and the UN Charter coming to the rescue of international law by saying, well, we did all those bad things in the past, but now we are going to channel our energies towards the grand task of decolonization. And as this whole conference has revealed, colonialism works in very complex ways. So the formal acquisition of sovereignty hardly touches the fact that colonialism and imperialism have all these multifarious, complex structural dimensions, which I would argue are central to the very identity of international law. So in other words, whenever international law extends out, it carries within its sovereignty, and it reproduces itself in various complicated ways. That's a quick answer.
Thank you. And we have questions. I invite you to the mic, please.
Okay, I'm delighted to hear we have time. Tony, I mean, first of all, this panel has been fantastic in drawing together the themes that we've been hearing for the last 2.5 days, and I'm especially delighted to see Tony, you drawing together critical race theory and international law theory, because that's the place that I find myself, and it's often the kind of question arises, what does international law have to do with critical race theory? And the answer, of course, from the perspective of someone who thinks about international law from a third world approach is everything. It has everything to do with race, and in fact, in some ways, encountering the theme that this symposium has been constructed around is itself an odd experience, because race and sovereignty, if you think about it from an international law perspective, are of course a braided logic throughout, forever. I mean, sovereignty was, as you've just brilliantly articulated, a white construct that was exclusive to a particular part of the world and was in and of itself predicated on that exclusion and then all the mechanisms that it produced. But that's not the sense in which race and sovereignty is being engaged in this symposium, which has been so informative and instructive for me to think of them as oppositional in this completely different way that as an international law person or someone thinking and encountering imperial history would never really imagine race and sovereignty juxtaposed as two separate mechanisms of subordination, as it has been described in some instances in some of the panels here. So what I wanted to ask you actually is to say a little bit more about the idea of internal colonization and the way in which today, in the contemporary world and thinking about international law, we do encounter that juxtaposition. So race and sovereignty. So as you, again, brilliantly pointed out, the way that folks in critical race theory encounter and reject claims of post-raciality, we on the other side may encounter and reject ideas of post-coloniality, right? So that's the juxtaposition where race operates in one way domestically and colonial the idea of the colonial operates in a particular way to produce the third world at the international level. But then you've pointed out, and I just want you to speak a little bit for the benefit of all of us here, that there's a fourth world, that there's this idea of the indigenous within the third world that is now really in the framing of the way we might think in international law terms of how does this race and sovereignty mechanism operate. So I just invite you to tell us a little bit about your thoughts on that topic.
Sure. Well, I think, as several commentators pointed out, the whole division between race and sovereignty, I think, was problematized in various ways, and I think we were getting closer to that braiding, which is more familiar to international law scholars. About the fourth world, I think there are a couple of things going on. On one hand, I think there is a process where even though, first I'll talk about the fourth world. So it is the term given to indigenous peoples, and it's so powerful that the Indigenous Declaration talks about self-determination. Self-determination is not a completed project. There are so many people, not just indigenous peoples, but ethnic minorities, which are still fighting for and arguing for self-determination. And we have a recent decision of the International Court of Justice. Dealing with this whole question, it's so complex, it's almost like slavery. I mean, I think one of the reasons why slavery seems to be just immune to the issue of reparations is because it's so fundamental to the system that it's almost like once we start thinking about it, the system won't exist as we know it. It really is just so fundamental. And so self-determination is something like that, because we're looking into the origins of sovereignty itself. And international law wants to presume the existence of sovereignty in some way, because otherwise there's this endless regression almost of legitimacy and where does this come from. So we see in the Kosovo case, the ICJ is saying, look, we don't want to decide this really. It's so fundamental. But of course, to many peoples, indigenous peoples, minorities, I don't know what to call it, the golden scepter, the ring, the whatever it is of sovereignty is so, very powerful. So on one hand, there's the fourth world. On the other hand, there is what I would call not even the first world, but in the form of the United States, the 1+ world. Because I think what is happening in the United States, it's constitutional law scholars that need to, I think, look at these issues. The whole question of the Schmittian executive. I try to avoid Schmitt as much as possible, but at some stage it becomes impossible to sort of ignore him. You see, what's interesting to me about the United States is that we're moving in a direction where, in terms of the customary laws of war, we are now legally formulating a war in which there is no temporal limit. So there's no temporal limit. There is no territorial limit, because if we take the issue of drones seriously, actually we could go anywhere. The whole world is a battlefield. So there's no territorial limit. Neither, if we look at the issue of preemption, neither is it necessary for us to actually be attacked. Because under the Bush doctrine of preemption, which has not been entirely disclaimed, who knows what's going to happen with Iran, the argument is we don't have to be injured, we don't even have to anticipate injury. An emerging threat is sufficient to justify going to war. So this is the whole question of sovereign discretion. And if you're a super sovereign, there's super discretion. And it's going to be a war, it's going to be a war like no other. And also we have nuclear weapons, right? But the whole idea is we're sensible about this. We're civilized. We have nuclear weapons and we know how to properly manage them. Whereas giving nuclear weapons to anybody else that we don't like, who is uncivilized, even though they claim it is for their self-defense, is something that we just cannot tolerate. So there is sovereignty going in both directions. One A++ sovereignty and a fourth world and perhaps even a fifth world. Migrant workers, I think there's a huge amount to be written and thought about migrant workers, and that takes us into issues of capitalism and development, but we can't handle all that. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes.
Let's see. I guess I wanted to ask thoughts on this. That I feel that actually that it's in this discussion of sovereignty that we have to bring, I guess, spirituality into it, and I guess the worldview of the parties in question. Because if one is of a spiritual worldview in which they are connected with nature, versus one which is in opposition to nature, one's whole idea of even what sovereignty will be different. And what I mean by that is that you have, say, indigenous peoples, even how they name themselves is going to relate to the shared space they share, as well as the land in which they regard as well, as opposed to right now what we call the state is basically an area defined by resource allocation. And that, like say, if I talk about the continent of Africa, that one of the greatest, I guess to say the two greatest problems are going to be the standing armies and the boundaries. If anyone wanted to really solve any problems, it would actually be to eliminate the concept of the state itself. And it would actually be people going back into how they actually naturally relate to the environment themselves, and to say, as human beings, that, talking about this whole thing, using this present construct as its own cultural expression, that it's because it's oppositional to nature, it doesn't see human beings as part of the continuum of the environment itself. And so therefore human beings are placed outside of it as opposed to being an intrinsic part of the cycle of life. And so that I think at some point we actually have to have, I guess, a real discussion about, I guess, what we actually want, because on some level it sounds like most groups simply want acceptance within this system as opposed to actually really expressing whether or not they want to have their intrinsic value, I guess, to express their intrinsic value as who they actually are on this planet. I just think that if we don't get down to the very base understanding of who I am, that all of this ends up really not really going anywhere.
Thank you.
Do you mind if I say something about that briefly?
Please. We're going to take probably, let's see, take everybody in the queue. So we'll go about another, how many more minutes do we have? So we have 0 minutes.
Let's keep going.
So yeah,
We're going to expand the paradigm.
let's
We're going
let's
beyond
hijack
the
the
zero.
spaceship.
I'll ask your forbearance for another 5 minutes, okay?
Okay, without disagreeing with you at all about the problems and inequities of a utilitarian relationship and the separation from nature, there is also a problem of the romanticization of indigenous people who are seen, I think, in an Edenic framework as kind of innocent inhabitants of this space which we still dominate. 30 years ago in Australia there was a big badge going around, the movement against uranium mining put out, which said, land rights, not uranium. Now, I don't happen to agree, be in favour of digging up uranium to make bombs with them, but you don't give people land rights with strings attached. Okay, it's our kind of fantasy, i.e. settler fantasy, that these are kind of innocent people in tune with nature. And this has various unpleasant consequences. One is it delegitimizes from the concept of authentic aboriginality people who don't happen to, live in this harmonious natural place. What about people who've got an ordinary job and live in the city but happen to be indigenous? They're excluded from this in an invidious way, which ends up feeding into land rights legislation, native title legislation in Australia. I think there's something similar going on here too, in something like, say, the Mashpee case, where native title is framed on a concept of authenticity which has the effect of excluding from native entitlement the maximum number of Aboriginal people that you can. It does so by making legitimate recipients of native title people who by definition have not been colonised. In other words, almost nobody. And this ties into the kind of colonial romance of the kind of innocent savage.
I'm sorry. I really invite you to carry on after, but I think we have to acknowledge the folks who've been standing in line.
Yeah, I just wanted to get back to this notion of the usefulness and utility of settler colonialism as a rubric to understand imperialism. And I agree with you wholeheartedly, Patrick, that settler colonialism, of course, is not based on individual intent or motive. But what I'm curious about is historically when we've used settler colonialism as an analytic frame, it's come with the term whiteness attached to it, right? Historically, we've talked about white settler colonialism. Australia, the United States, Canada, New Zealand were white settler colonies. So I'm very curious of the dropping off of the whiteness about it. So what I am concerned about is the current expansion of the category of settler colonists to include enslaved blacks, to include indentured Asians, and to include contemporary migrant workers. I think that is the problem with the rubric of settler colonialism today, not in its usefulness to understand white settler colonialism, because the utility was the interpolation of all of these, people thrown out of Europe, also out of processes of dispossession, but their interpolation into power precisely through the racial category of whiteness. Right? So the whiteness was absolutely specific to settler colonialism. It wasn't just this throw-off, and I'm really interested in how this kind of colorblind approach to now we are all settler colonists and it's got nothing to do with whiteness anymore, I think is a big problem. So I think the difference between you not wanting to be a settler colonist in Australia and then turning around and calling black people and Asian settler colonists is a huge world of difference.
Okay, well, I'll be as quick as I can about that. I mean, firstly, that's why I mentioned situations, like Tibet and other non-white situations where settler colonialism is conducted by non-whites against non-whites. You might say white on white where Ireland was concerned, for instance. The point being, I'm not a racial suprematist or anything. I'm not in favour of race. The point is that race is not of the essence of settler colonialism. It's a different story. Okay, and it is used to confuse the basic dynamics of settler colonialism. And I don't understate the privations that Asians on Hawaiian plantations went through. But from an indigenous point of view, they are still not indigenous. It's simple. They're still, even though they're coerced, They're still taking up indigenous resources and moving indigenous people away from their own spaces and their own modes of reproduction. So the point about race and colour is that they obscure, in the case of settler colonialism, the primary relationship. Now, so far as slavery is concerned in this country, blackness and slavery became equivalent. And of course you can't discuss chattel slavery after about 1690, say, without introducing colour into it. My point is not that colour should be understated or race should be understated or anything like that, but that there is a specific relationship whose specificity, i.e. that between the native who is losing and the system that expropriates that native. And that loss on the native's part gets lost when any kind of specificity on the part of the settler is introduced, because you just get, well, the natives are people of colour too and they're all in the same country, but you lose the specificity of their loss. Simple.
Well, and also just to talk again, to mention, we're talking about issues of complicity, right? And in Hawaii, I think you're hard-pressed to actually talk about Asian labor as indentured, number one. But number two, the formation, I don't know anybody that's actually talked about enslaved Africans as settler colonists. I've never actually heard that, ever, so I'd be very curious about that. In this context, we've heard about the question of freed blacks moving onto Indian land and that complicated story of seeking freedom in the aftermath of slavery and being tied to a U.S. settler state colonial process of dispossessing tribes of their land. So that's complicated. With in Hawaii, it's post-World War II Japanese-American ascendancy through the Democratic political party that people have actually theorized as a form of settler colonialism that isn't white. And those aren't indentured Asians at all. And that's just one example. So I mean, I think we have to be really specific in terms of place, period, and who we're talking about and what historical trajectories they come out of.
Thank you. I'm going to ask the last two questions to come together, and then anyone on the panel can respond. Would that be so? Maivan, you and first you, and then Malaika, and then we'll have the panel respond.
The microphone up there with them.
Right there.
Okay, fine. I just wanted to address this primarily to Antony, but I'd be happy to hear what the other panelists also have to say. And I couldn't agree with you more that sovereignty was a Western invention in the pre-World War II period. And I think I look at sovereignty among European powers as the sovereign equality of the West to efficiently plunder the rest. I mean, that's really what sovereignty was. I mean, the doctrine of discovery as interpreted by Marshall was about that we line up so that we don't have to fight each other to get Indian lands. I mean, this is, so...
Berlin Conference.
Right, okay. But after the Second World War, I think the picture does change, as you very well know, because during just as the war was concluding, or even before, the Western colonial powers understood that the whole notion of self-determination in the form of defensive sovereignty was gaining ground in Asia and Africa. And so they had to deal with that new reality, after the Second World War. Now, the first thing that they thought up was not the UN as a mechanism, but the Bretton Woods institution. And that would be a way to maintain the intrusion of Western sovereignty on the rest, right, by other means. And then the UN was then, the sort of more cosmetic side of the Bretton Woods institution in a real sense. And working at the Ralph Bunche Institute in New York, where doing the history of the UN was one of his main projects, I didn't know this, but I understood from listening to colleagues who were there at the founding of the UN that very seriously the Western powers only wanted it to be a one-chamber body, only the Security Council. And that would have been, indeed, the small coterie of powers that would decide for the rest what the global order would be like. And I think it was the presence of the many South American countries that said that they wouldn't have been in the Security Council. It would have been a small group. So the General Assembly was created. But once that was created and Asian African countries got in, with their now defensive notions of sovereignty, then they began to give a new meaning to sovereignty, which is the one that I think we need to reclaim from the Bretton Woods effort that has all but it has largely diminished that, and that is in the notions of non-interference in the internal affairs of state. After all, it's not the little countries that are going to be interfering, so the non-interference is a check against the big guys, and also the permanent sovereignty of resources. I think those two things are really still important aspects of external sovereignty to maintain. Now, as far as internal sovereignty is concerned, I think that's when Robin's issue of transformation could very well come in. I think that what we need to do is that the leaders of the third world have now become complicitous in the Bretton Woods institution, and so we have work to do in the internal sovereignty sense, and I would suggest that the two things are, we must only have the sort of internal sovereignty that guarantees, that makes, settles, and that has as its main project equal access to resources and equal authorship or equal weight for imaginations. And this is what I mean. In other words, authorship of the constituent parts of the sovereign, and access, equal access. So it's both a question of, and I think the indigenous people were really trying to point in that direction explicitly or otherwise. Maintenance over resources, and also inventing the sort of partnership that they wanted now to co-author with other constituents of the state. So, comments on that would be very helpful.
Thank you. Malika will take yours as the last comment or question.
Well, my comment and question is very related to Professor Lam's comments, because I admire her analysis of looking for crevices and wedges in which to tear apart imperial colonization, and whether it's settler colonialism or the period of pre-British or any other period of colonialism. But my question sort of began, with first an apology that India beat Sri Lanka. But on the other hand, I have never been one to be very excited by seeing men run around with balls and bats on a piece of land. And that only begins my question, which I have been mulling over for a number of days about, and I'll have to look at my notes because it's been so long I've been thinking about this, that to me, gender and community are very bounded by territory. That notion of territoriality is what marks us as belonging to here or there or somewhere else. And so I was thinking to myself, if I was a homing pigeon, where would I go? Would I belong to Los Angeles, where I'm a citizen of 7 years? Would I go back to Wisconsin of 21 years? Or would I go back to Calcutta, which I've only spent less than 9 months there? And to me, that is a question about how do we engage the seduction that citizenship provides us? Because I think regardless of place and time and our identity, that question of sovereignty and citizenship is the issue of these legal fictions that we are engaging in. And now I've forgotten who exactly discussed the issue of these fictions, but it's that combination of seduction and fiction that we are all mired in. And I would like to remind at least myself that there was a brief period during the decolonization movement of the last century where we had starry eyes as to a thing called the non-alignment movement, and to the whole notion of creating a completely different economic order that really imagined the decolonization not just of peoples but of our minds. And that was such a transformation where we all had a different view and imagination, so like Professor Lam said. And then the other question I just is sort of more a theoretical one about international law, which is that I'm not entirely sure what you mean by sovereignty only being an issue of the West in the last 200 years. After all, the globe is far older, and so it's possible we need to think about other forms of sovereignty long prior to the emancipation or the Enlightenment period of the West. And the construction of the West as the only party could have that entitlement to those language.
Okay, thank you. We have all of 2 minutes for our responses. I sorry to do this to the panel, but I've been informed that the shuttle buses are waiting. I know that there's some people who have wanted to get on them. So with my apologies, comments, reactions to the last 2 comments. Any?
I can't possibly do justice to them. I acknowledge them both. So I'll end up with a kind of one-sentence anti-colonial joke that I think means something in terms of alternatives. It's about cricket. Ashish Nandi, the great Indian anti-colonial writer like C.L.R. James found himself stuck when writing a book on cricket with the colonial trap. And the first sentence of Ashish's book on cricket runs as follows: cricket was a game invented. Cricket is a game played by Indians that was accidentally invented by the English.
Like chutney. The only thing, just really quickly, that I want to just go back to is, and you just mentioned this, is when Robin Kelly actually called for transformative politics. And that's where I think it matches your call to actually be theorizing indigenous sovereignties, right? I mean, different kinds of sovereignties that aren't Western, and actually, then it gets to the question of, are we going to drop the S word? I'm not about to drop the S word, but I think that part of it is we've got to, again, not use it as the placeholder, which is what was said earlier, and to actually talk about what do we mean in every different instance, and actually historicize these concepts. And I do think that pre-Western indigenous forms of sovereignty, aside from the tendency for people to distort or romanticize them, I do think that we can really think about them as epistemological resources for reimagining a different way of being.
Yes. I agree.
Yeah. Well, just very quickly, Madam's comment was very rich, and a whole comment in itself. I'm not sure whether it requires a response, but I would simply say, I think I said that self-determination takes very different forms. I see what happened in Tunisia and Egypt as being yet another form of self-determination. This is not self-determination from some external colonial power, but self-determination seen in terms of people wanting to take control of their lives and to organize precisely an economic system that will work for them and that would be equitable. So I think it's a new type of self-determination, democratic self-determination or whatever it is. In terms of the issue of cricket, well, I can only envy you if you have redeemed or liberated yourself from the obsession and suffering that accompanies any cricket fan. In terms of your larger issue, I think both of us are in what I would call heated agreement, because what I precisely said was that how was it decided that the non-European world lacked sovereignty? How was that decided? Because there were so many different varieties of sovereignty. So I think I agree with both of you that the question is whether there is something of that indigenous sovereignty which actually provides imaginative resources for thinking of different ways of organizing the world, different ways of thinking about these issues, which might still have some effect. I mean, my real fear is that the countries that have succeeded are countries which have bought into the whole idea of development in a very powerful way. And, it is these other countries now which are going into Africa. It's sometimes called the second scramble. So it is that logic that is being replayed in this other form, and that I think is problematic.
Thank you so much. I want to thank the panel. I think we have one, maybe final announcement. And
thanks to Cheryl for moderating our last roundtable. Happy to introduce you guys. Thanks to all of you for, again, helping us throw a cool party once a year. Like I said at the beginning of this, we hope to see you next year for the 6th annual. A couple of logistics. The vans are here for those of you who are going back to the Angelino. This concludes the event. And somebody left their glasses in the bathroom. If you're missing your glasses, they are up here. Thank you for coming, and have a wonderful return home, wherever that may be. And thanks to Maya.